a black man, but he's damn glad to live in a black man's country all the same. I'm calling a corroboree of all the natives of New South Wales to send a petition to the King in an endeavour to improve our conditions. All the black man wants is representation in federal parliament. There is also plenty of fish in the river for us all, and land to grow all we want. 150 years ago, the Aboriginals owned Australia, and today he demands more than the white man's charity. He wants the right to live.
For the first time, the newspapers supported them and their voices began to be heard. All over the country, Aborigines and whites were reading and hearing about the conditions on the New South Wales reserves. Aborigines began to organise. In 1932, an Aboriginal elder, William Cooper, came to Melbourne to start the Aborigines League. The aims of the League were to get equal rights for Aborigines. William Cooper had started a petition to the King of England, and he travelled to reserves throughout the state asking Aborigines to sign it.
He'd come up here and talk to the people and tell them they had rights and they should press for it. He asked to have a member of Parliament, Aboriginal member, so that Aborigines could go to that member and talk with him, where they couldn't relate to a white person because they knew that he just, scrap it all and forget about it. All the petitions they ever had was put in the waste paper basket. He worked really hard and went around getting names, and I believe it would cover so many miles, all the names. It was that long.
After 6 frustrating years of campaigning, William Cooper presented the petition to the federal government in Canberra.
It was just a waste of time. That poor man did all that work and nothing was done about it. It was to be sent to King George. I don't think it ever left Australia.
In 1937, an Aboriginal shearer, Bill Ferguson, arrived in Sydney to set up his Aborigines Progressive Association. He got the support of a fiery speaker and writer, Jackie Patton. Together they set the aims of getting full citizenship rights and the scrapping of the Aborigines Protection Board. They used every possible means to broaden their support, not only from Aborigines, but from Australians in general. Ferguson travelled to the reserves to get young Aborigines to join him in the fight.
And I was quite interested when I learned that he was coming to Brewarrina to hold a meeting. I attended the meeting, and when he asked for a delegate to attend a conference in Dubbo, I was nominated as a delegate to go to the conference at Dubbo. The membership was wholly Aboriginal, and there was a resolution passed that we visit the North Coast missions and to organise those people. We had, on the back of the old Chev 4 that we were travelling in, Bill Ferguson and myself, we had this large banner right across the back in big 6-inch letters. It was written, "Full citizens' rights for the Aborigines." And Bill's son, as we used to pass through the towns, we'd slink down to hide ourselves from the people so that they wouldn't see us sitting in the car, because we didn't want them to recognise us. When we pulled up for petrol, if there was a policeman present at all, he'd always walk over and ask Bill for his licence, check it out. And it just showed that we were sort of held in suspicion or something.
Progressive Association organisers travelled to reserves all over the state, gathering evidence of the conditions their people lived under. Meetings were held on reserves, and local branches of the Progressive Association were set up. Aborigines were starting to speak out on the reserves and were making demands for change. The Protection Board responded by bringing in regulations that gave tougher powers to the managers.
If some man had a run-in with the manager, he was disqualified from the mission, blackballed we called it, and wasn't allowed within a 5-mile or 25-mile radius of the mission, and would have to leave his family behind. They used to have to creep back at night to see their families. These men were considered a bad influence on the people because they were so outspoken. We were regarded as agitators and therefore not allowed onto Aboriginal reserves. And lots of places, the people were all behind Bill. They came out and bought membership tickets to enable us to get from one place to another. And we got a lot of support from all of those people with whom we came in contact on that trip.
Bill Ferguson returned to Sydney to push for an investigation into the Protection Board. The state government was under pressure, and the Premier of New South Wales, Stephens, announced that a select committee of inquiry was to be formed. Stephens placed his own government members as the majority on the committee. Reserve managers were brought to Sydney to present their side of the case. Bill Ferguson, representing the Aboriginal people, was then allowed to question witnesses and present his evidence. The press went to town. Ferguson's evidence hit the headlines and the Protection Board was exposed. The government majority on the committee refused to take any further part in the investigation and the inquiry collapsed. On the last day, a protest was held at Parliament House. Members of trade unions, housewives associations and the Feminist Club turned up. The investigation was dead, but support for Aborigines had spread.
Yes, well, after the visit of the Select Committee, the things seemed to cease in regards to boys being apprenticed out and that sort of thing. I only know of 3 or 4 girls who were sent out after the visit of the Select Committee. The only boy who had reached an employable age, they could go out and take a job at droving or station work. They weren't interfered with. So I think Bill did stir something up in that regard.
But white managers continued to rule the reserves, and the people still existed on handouts. The men were forced to work for little or no wages. The Aborigines Progressive Association planned to hold the first national Aboriginal protest while the whites celebrated their 150 years of settlement.
Australia today takes her place among the nations. We are building a great industrial civilization on this primary basis and developing a new race, a new force in the culture of mind and body. In this sunny land, sport builds a racial physique equal to any in the world. Australian history already bears the blazonry of glory won by our volunteers on the battlefields of the Great War. Yet only 150 years ago, Australia was still a nameless island inhabited by savages. To mark this proud record of progress, the government of New South Wales decided to celebrate with 3 months of pageantry and carnival.
Part of the celebrations was to be a reenactment of the landing of the first white settlers in Sydney. Aborigines called it a day of mourning. The Progressive Association sent handbills to Aborigines all over the country, urging them to attend the first all-Aboriginal conference on that day. Meanwhile, The Protection Board had brought a group of Aborigines from west of the state to take part in the white settlers' reenactment. Aboriginal organisers tried to fine them. They wanted to ask them not to participate, but the Protection Board had them locked up in the police compound next to the dog kennels. They had been brought to Sydney under the threat of having their rations cut off.
History flames into life as the dramatic scenes of the first landing at Circular Quay are reenacted at Palm Cove. We see the natives gathering in corroboree to ward off the invaders, just as they then did. In the face of menacing savages, the white men advance up the shore of the new land.
There appear to be no women amongst them. Is there any likelihood of an ambush?
So a handful of Englishmen took possession of a continent, a vast, unknown, primeval land.
While the celebrations took place, Aboriginal delegates gathered outside the conference hall in silent protest at their treatment. Inside the conference, speeches were made, and Bill Ferguson broadened the aims to include freehold land rights for Aborigines. At the end of the conference, Jackie Patton read the resolution. We, representing the Aborigines of Australia, hereby make protest against the callous treatment of our people by the white men during the past 150 years. We want full citizens' rights and equality within the community. On the reserves, agitation against the Protection Board continued, and the board tried to force the people off the land. On a reserve called Cumragunja, the board leased the best land to white farmers and brought in a new manager named McGuigan.
I know that one man who has now passed on came over to see McQuiggan whether if he would let someone take a very sick man into town, and he just laughed at him and said no. He said, and he pulled a revolver out. This is what he told us. He said he pulled a revolver out, and he said, I never crawled in my life to any white man. He said, but I crawled that day. He said, I was afraid he was going to shoot me. Those that had children going to school, their children got some rations, which went in a day. Apart from that, the rest of the people, well, they could just starve. I went around with a petition because so many babies had died. In fact, 2 died on one day, and we were horrified at the deaths that were happening. And so I went around to a lot of the mothers, and they signed it. And I went to people who had lost their babies, and they were afraid to sign because the ones that had their husbands working here were afraid what would happen. They'd have their rations stopped, they'd have the jobs taken away.
Petitions were sent to the Protection Board asking them to remove the manager. Nothing was done. In February 1939, the Aborigines Progressive Association sent Jackie Patton to Cumragunja.
And he came to tell the people how things were and why they were, telling them about their rights. And he held a meeting in the hall. He asked permission, he got it. And when he walked onto that stage, a policeman walked in the door and stood there and listened to the meeting. I think they were on for arresting him that day. They had to go and look up something in the law which said no one was allowed to incite Aborigines to, revolt or, you know.
The day after Patton's arrest, the people of Cumragunja took action. They walked off the reserve and began the first Aboriginal strike.
You know, Aborigines had been browbeaten and